The Nicaraguan regime sentenced the student leader Lesther Aleman to 15 years in prison, accusing him of conspiracy and sedition. In addition, the socialist regime of dictator Daniel Ortega also sentenced former guerrilla and opposition leader Doria Tejas to the same years of prison at the Chipote prison. This prison is actually quite symbolic and quite famous from Nicaragua, because we need to remember that this particular prison is basically the one where the vast majority of political prisoners are being held. Almost every single political figure that the socialist regime of Daniel Ortega detains, they put it in this prison, in the Chipote prison. So, of course, human rights organizations condemn this trial of Lesther Aleman and Doria Tejas as null and void for taking place behind closed doors. On this point, it is important to remember that Lesther Aleman was the main leader of the widespread protests that took place a couple of years ago in different cities of the Central American nation. A protest which main demand was the end of the tyranny, freedom, the end of dictatorship, and of course, free and fair elections in Nicaragua. This was a really grim and violent episode, given the fact that the Nicaraguan regime decided to oppress protesters in the worst manner that you can possibly imagine. I mean, we're talking about torture, we're talking about kidnapping, we're talking about homicides, all type of violence perpetrated against the Nicaraguan protesters, which was, I mean, the element that was actually more controversial on this horrible episode was the fact that, such as it has happened on Venezuela, the Nicaraguan regime decided to deploy their paramilitary force to repress the protests. And this was the faction of the Nicaraguan regime that committed the cruelest and the most horrible acts of violence. So Tejas has been since this moment a pretty symbolic figure in Nicaragua. He is essentially the symbol of freedom in the Central American nation, especially during the moment of this protest where the Nicaraguan regime decided to open a dialogue with different members of the opposition, and Lesther Aleman was the only one who dared to essentially to tell Daniel Ortega in his face that he was a dictator, that he was a criminal, that he was killing Nicaraguans. In fact, he even told Daniel Ortega that his dictatorship was already worse than the one that he always fought during the time of guerrilla, the dictatorship of the Somoza family. So since that moment, Lesther Aleman essentially became persona non grata to the Nicaraguan regime. They arrested him and now they sentenced him to 15 years in prison. Of course, such as many human rights organizations says, in a null and void trial, given the fact that this took place behind closed doors. The case of Tejas is also quite remarkable. It's also quite interesting because Doria Tejas, we need to remember, she was a pretty prominent member of the Sandinista guerrilla along with Daniel Ortega. She fought alongside Daniel Ortega during the Sandinista guerrilla years when they were fighting against the dictatorship of the Somoza family. Nevertheless, she was one of the few members of this guerrilla that eventually saw the reality of Daniel Ortega. They noticed that Daniel Ortega was following an authoritarian path, and she decided to become opposite to the regime of Daniel Ortega. She essentially decided to leave the guerrilla, to leave the revolution, to leave the government, and to be faithful to her intellectual honesty, to her political position, to her political ideology. And just in the same way that she fought the Somoza dictatorship, she decided, now I'm gonna fight the Ortega's dictatorship. Given the situation, she of course has been brutalized. She has received all types of attacks by the Nicaraguan regime, such as the case of Sergio Ramirez, a case that I already told you about on a previous episode. He used to be actually the former vice president of Daniel Ortega during his first government after the revolution won. He was part of the revolution, he was part of the guerrilla, but essentially he noticed that Daniel Ortega was turning into a dictator, and he decided to become an opposition leader to fight against him. This is the same case of Doria Tejas, who is now in prison in the Cipote prison with Lesther Aleman, with many other political prisoners in this Caribbean, in this Central American nation. And of course, we are going to keep telling you everything that is taking place in Nicaragua, because just as the cases of Venezuela and Cuba, these are horrible dictatorships that many people refuse to talk about. This is not the case here on Newsweek. We will always talk about these types of situations, because there is nothing worse than a democracy that eventually turns into a dictatorship hell, into a tyranny, essentially, which is currently the case of Nicaragua with dictator Daniel Ortega. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.